Have you ever asked yourself why the man you love decided to stop looking at you the way he used to? You didn't click on this by chance. Something inside you shifted the moment you read that question. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was that pressure you've been carrying in your chest for weeks, for months, maybe for years now. That pressure that refuses to lift, no matter how hard you try to outrun it, no matter how often you go out, no matter how many times you repeat to yourself that you're already over it. You're not over it. And somewhere inside, you already know that. You did everything the way you thought you were supposed to. You showed up whenever she needed you. You answered before she even finished the message. You skipped time with your friends, left your own goals half-built, gave up sleep, gave up energy, gave up pieces of yourself. And still, somewhere along that road, something cracked. Something you can't quite name. Something nobody ever sits you down and explains. Because it's easier for people to head out your shoulder and tell you you'll find someone better. As if that's actually an answer to the thing that's been gnawing at you. Because the real question was never whether you'll find someone better. The real question is why. Why the more you poured out, the less you seemed to matter. Why the harder you tried, the further she pulled away. Why the man who barely seemed to try at all ended up standing in the exact spot you thought belonged to you. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The part that goes against everything you were raised to believe. She didn't walk away because you were bad to her. In some ways, she walked away because you were too good to her. And I don't mean that kindness itself is a flaw. I mean something far heavier than that. Somewhere in the middle of it all, you quietly stopped being you and started becoming a mirror of what you assumed she wanted. And the moment you disappeared into that mirror, without even realizing it, you stopped being magnetic. You stopped being real. You stopped being someone. I know this stings. I know some part of you wants to push back against it right now, wants to find the counter-argument. That's a normal reaction. Nobody wants to hear that a piece of the wound started with them. But if you're still here, if that opening question landed somewhere true, then a part of you already suspects this. And over the next few minutes, we're going to pull this thread apart, slowly, honestly, without softening it, and without pretending it doesn't hurt. This isn't a video full of pickup lines or clever tactics. I'm not here to hand you scripts or shortcuts. What we're about to look at runs much deeper than any of that. We're going to talk about how attraction actually operates beneath the surface. Nothing like what you were told growing up. We're going to talk about the hidden rules of desire, the ones no teacher, no parent, and no romantic movie ever bothered to explain. And we're going to talk about the one shift that can actually change your story. Not a new way to act around a woman, but a new way to stand with yourself. Stay with me, because what's coming might be the most honest thing you've heard in a long time. Let me walk you through something. Researchers once studied couples navigating emotional strain. Some were asked to remember times they had fully bent to their partner's wishes, setting their own aside completely. Others were asked to remember moments when they held their ground, even if it caused a little friction. And the results confounded anyone who doesn't understand how the mind actually works. The partners of the people who consistently caved showed steadily lower satisfaction over time. Not more warmth, not more closeness, less. Constant self-sacrifice instead of building gratitude and lasting love did the opposite. It drained desire, killed the sense of challenge, and in plenty of cases, quietly eroded respect. So how does giving more end up producing less? The answer sits in how our brains are wired around value and around wanting. Buried deep in human biology is a mechanism inherited across millions of years of evolution that's constantly, silently measuring the worth of everything around us. Not in terms of morality, but in terms of scarcity. How rare something is, how much effort it takes to obtain it. When something comes easily, the brain files it under low value. Not because it's actually inferior, but simply because so little effort went into securing it. When something demands effort, risk, the real possibility of loss, the brain flags it as precious, as worth chasing. That's not some poetic idea. That's biology. That's dopamine. It's the exact same circuitry that makes a hard-won achievement feel infinitely more rewarding than something handed to you. That circuit doesn't switch off in relationships. It runs the same way. When you become the man who's always reachable, who never pushes back, who reshapes his schedule and his mood around someone else's needs, you're sending a message straight to that person's brain. And that message isn't, "I'm a good man who deserves love." It's, "Nothing in my life outweighs you." Consciously, that might feel romantic, but the brain interprets it completely differently. There's something psychologists refer to as the accessibility bias. When we perceive something as effortlessly available, our internal sense of its value drops, regardless of the thing's actual quality. Not because the object changed, but because the signal we received about how rare it is changed. And rarity, the nagging sense that something might vanish tomorrow, is one of the strongest engines behind human desire. This explains something you've probably watched happen, maybe even to someone close to you. That guy who never seemed to be trying too hard, who wasn't glued to his phone, who had his own life and his own passions. He pulled people in a way the man who gave everything simply couldn't. Not because he was more deserving, not because he was a better human being, but because the way he carried himself sent a different signal entirely. I have a world of my own, and that world stands on its own, whether you're part of it or not. And this is where things get genuinely interesting, because none of this is really about surface-level chemistry. It's about identity. It's about who you are when nobody's watching, when there's no audience to perform for. So let me ask you something that might sting a little. When's the last time you did something purely for yourself? Something that lit you up, without stopping to check if she'd approve, without running it through the filter of the relationship, without shaping it to fit what you assumed she expected? If it takes you a while to think of an answer, that's telling you something. There's a concept in psychology called relational fusion. It happens when a person slowly, almost invisibly, starts to define themselves entirely through the relationship they're in. Their hobbies rearrange around their partner. Their plans always orbit the other person's plans. Every decision gets filtered through at what will she think? How will she react? Will this upset her? Eventually, that person forgets who they are outside of that frame. And when the relationship ends or starts to crack, something devastating happens. It's not just the other person that's lost. It's the self. And that hollow feeling, not knowing who you are on your own, is one of the most disorienting things a person can go through. Often far worse than the breakup itself. What's unsettling is that this fusion never feels like a loss while it's happening. It feels like love. It feels like devotion. It feels noble, even beautiful. It's only later, sometimes years later, that you look back and realize how much of yourself quietly disappeared, without anyone forcing your hand, without anyone demanding it. You gave it away because somewhere along the line you were taught that's what real love looks like. But there's a massive difference between giving yourself to someone and dissolving into them. Real giving comes from a person who already has a center, a foundation, a gravity of their own. Dissolving comes from emptiness trying to fill itself through someone else's presence. And people, even without being able to explain it, feel that difference. They can't articulate it, but they sense it. In the energy, in the dynamic, in what it's like being close to someone who's disappeared versus someone who simply chooses to show up. Right now, you might be thinking this is easy to say from the outside, that when you fall for someone, when they become the center of your world, everything else naturally fades. And you're right about one part. That feeling is inevitable. What isn't inevitable is building your entire life around that feeling until you're hollowed out by it. That's a decision, usually made unconsciously, but a decision nonetheless. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because what actually sits underneath that pattern isn't real generosity. There's something buried beneath it, something with a name most people avoid looking at directly. It's fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if you don't give absolutely everything, if you're not always on call, if you don't constantly prove your worth, the other person will figure out that you don't actually belong there. That if you show your limits, your own needs, your own priorities, they'll leave. And the cruelest twist is that this fear, instead of protecting the relationship, actively speeds up the very outcome it's trying to prevent. The psychologist John Bowlby, who spent decades studying how humans form bonds starting in infancy, identified what he called the attachment system. In simple terms, from childhood onward, we develop strategies to stay close to the people we perceive as our safety figures. Those strategies form based on how our caregivers responded to us early on, and once they're set, they tend to replay themselves automatically in our adult relationships. People who grew up with inconsistent caregiving sometimes met with warmth, sometimes met with silence, with no clear pattern to it, often develop what's called anxious attachment. They learn that love is uncertain, that it can vanish without warning, and they become hyper-attuned to any hint of distance. They get good at reading silences, at decoding small shifts in tone, at bracing for rejection before it happens. And to manage that anxiety, they fall back on the one thing they know: give more, be more present, shrink themselves down to take up less space, to be less trouble, to be easier to keep around. The problem is that a strategy which once made sense as a response to an unstable childhood becomes something that backfires in adulthood. It feeds the exact cycle it's trying to escape. Because the anxiety that gets projected outward, the constant hunger for reassurance, the emotional dependency that builds, that's precisely the fuel that pushes the other person further away. And when they pull back, even slightly, the anxious person reads it as proof of their worst fear, which pushes them to cling harder, which drives more distance, spiraling into something exhausting for everyone involved. Spotting this pattern in yourself isn't easy. It takes brutal honesty. It takes sitting with the discomfort of a reflection that doesn't always look the way you'd like it to. But seeing it is the only real starting point for changing it. Because until you see it clearly, you'll keep living out the same story with a different name attached to it. And here's something I think matters enormously. There's no trick, no hack, no set of behaviors that can replace the actual work of knowing yourself. You can master the perfect calculated text. You can force yourself to seem unavailable on purpose. You can copy the mannerisms of people who radiate confidence. But if underneath it all, you're still running on fear, still chasing approval, still convinced you're not enough as you are, that emptiness leaks through, always. People sense far more than we give them credit for. They can't name it, but they feel it. Real self-worth. Not the paper-thin kind built from repeating affirmations in a mirror, but the kind that comes from actually knowing yourself, from having made peace with your strengths and your flaws. Doesn't need constant proof. It doesn't need external approval to stay standing. And that difference shows. It shows in how you talk, in how you carry yourself, in how you react when things don't go as planned, in how you take up space. A man who knows who he is doesn't need someone else's love to confirm his worth. He can want that love. He can savor it deeply when it comes. He can hurt when it's gone. But he doesn't need it to function. He doesn't need it to know his life has direction and meaning. And ironically, that ability to not need is exactly what draws people in. Not as a strategy, but because it signals something the brain reads as genuinely valuable. This person has a life of his own. This person is at peace with himself. This person wants me because he's choosing me, not because he needs me to survive. There's something important here that I think people misread constantly. Talking about emotional independence, about having your own world, about not needing constant reassurance from someone else, doesn't mean turning cold. It doesn't mean putting up walls. It doesn't mean faking indifference when you actually care deeply. That shallow reading of independence does just as much damage as the opposite extreme. Real emotional independence isn't distance. It's groundedness. It's having a center of your own to relate from. A center that doesn't crumble when someone doesn't respond exactly how you hoped. A center that doesn't need to be filled by another person because it already carries its own weight. And from that center, you can actually be vulnerable. You can open up. You can say what you feel without that honesty turning into a desperate plea for someone to rescue you. There's a massive gap between telling someone, "I'm really into you, and I want to keep getting to know you," from a place of genuine excitement and freedom, and saying the exact same words from a place of need, from a place of "please don't go," from a place of "I need you to feel okay about myself." The words can look identical on paper. The energy behind them is worlds apart. And even though you can't see that energy, people feel it. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets brought up in conversations like this. Boundaries. Not as a manipulation tactic, not as a way to seem harder to get, but as a genuine expression of who you are and what you respect in yourself. A real boundary isn't a threat, and it isn't a warning shot. It's simply the natural line marking where you end and someone else begins. It's the plain statement that you have needs, values, and priorities that aren't up for negotiation just because someone else wants them to be. People without boundaries aren't more loving. They're more confusing. They build relationships with no structure, no mutual respect, none of that healthy tension that actually makes a relationship function. And here's something a lot of men don't want to hear, but it needs saying. Every time you swallowed something that genuinely bothered you instead of speaking up, every time you smiled through something that was quietly eating at you, every time you gave in on something you didn't actually want to give in on just to dodge conflict, you weren't being kind. You were stacking up silent resentment that poisons everything over time, and you were teaching the other person exactly how to treat you. People learn how to treat you based on what you allow, not always through some calculated decision on their part. It just happens, the way every human system naturally settles into a pattern. If you allow your needs to be brushed aside, that becomes the norm. If you allow your plans to always come second, that becomes the norm. Not because the other person is malicious, but because in the absence of a clear line, systems drift toward whatever they're allowed to become. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's the foundation of any relationship built on honesty and staying power. It's the only way for someone to actually know who they're with. And it's the only way for the love you receive to be real, because it's aimed at the actual you, not a filtered, edited version built to fit someone else's expectations. I want to sit with something else here, because it connects directly to everything we've covered so far. There's a belief so deeply woven into how a lot of men understand love that it's practically invisible. The idea that love is a transaction. That if you give enough, you'll get enough back. That if you're attentive enough, present enough, good enough, love becomes the natural payout for that effort. This belief makes sense. It comes from everywhere else in life. Work hard. Get results. Study with discipline. Pass the exam. Put in the effort. Move forward. That logic holds up in plenty of arenas. Applied to relationships, mechanically, it produces the exact opposite of what you're hoping for. Love, desire, attraction. None of these operate as a reward for good behavior. They're not a final grade handed out for effort. They're emotional states shaped by something far messier. Perception, energy, someone's entire emotional history, chemistry, timing, dozens of factors nobody controls. Understanding this isn't an invitation to give up on love. It's an invitation to set down the impossible weight of believing that doing everything right guarantees an outcome. That belief is exhausting, and it's also false. Love isn't manufactured. It's discovered. It's nurtured once it arrives, but it can't be forced into existence. What you actually control, the only real lever you have, is becoming the most honest, most fully realized version of yourself. Chase goals that light you up. Invest in real friendships. Take care of your body, your mind, your skills. Build an honest relationship with yourself. Learn to feel at ease in your own company, not as a tactic to attract someone, but because that's the only life actually worth living, whether someone's beside you or not. When you live from that place, the relationships that show up carry a different quality, because you're relating from fullness, not from lack. You're not looking to someone else to hand you what you're missing in yourself. And that changes everything. Let me show you something that might surprise you. From a neurological standpoint, attraction is tightly connected to a specific mental state researchers call the activation of the seeking system. This circuit, mapped out by neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, is the part of the brain that lights up during anticipation, when we sense something interesting might happen, when the outcome is uncertain but promising. It's the mind of the hunter before the hunt, not after. It's the mind of the explorer facing unfamiliar ground. Or when someone carries a world of their own, when they have interests that pull people in, when they're not entirely predictable, when the natural uncertainty around their availability is just part of who they are. They trigger that exact seeking system in the people around them. They spark dopamine. They spark attention. They spark the pull to learn more, to get closer, to uncover what's underneath. On the other hand, total predictability, constant availability, the guarantee that someone will always be there no matter what, shuts that system down. The brain stops seeking because it's already gotten everything, effortlessly. And once that system shuts off, boredom follows. Not as a conscious choice, not as betrayal, but as a neurological process running well below the level of conscious will. This doesn't mean you should fake unpredictability or play games with your availability just to keep someone hooked. That's a shallow, manipulative reading of something with much deeper roots. What it actually means is that the fullest version of you, the one with a world of his own passions, his own plans, his own limits, is naturally more magnetic than the version that empties itself out, trying to fit into someone else's gap. There's one more thing I want to address, something rarely explored in conversations like this: how we handle hard emotions inside a relationship. There's a tendency, especially among men raised on the idea that showing emotion equals weakness, to bury what they feel, to swallow the fear, the anger, the jealousy, the insecurity, to manage it the worst way possible, ignoring it until it erupts at the worst moment, or letting it leak out sideways through behaviors that quietly damage the relationship, with nobody quite understanding why. But there's the opposite extreme too, just as harmful. Having no filter whatsoever, reacting to every bit of friction, turning every small conflict into a full-blown crisis, leaning on the other person to regulate emotions you should be managing yourself. The healthy middle ground isn't either extreme. It's what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to feel something fully, to acknowledge it, to not run from it, and at the same time not be swallowed by it. To be able to say what I'm feeling right now is uncomfortable, and I can hold it without letting it wreck me or wreck what's around me. That capacity, described in different words across centuries of Stoic philosophy, but always circling back to the same core idea, that we can't control what happens to us, only how we respond, is one of the most quietly magnetic qualities a person can carry. Not just because it looks good from the outside, though it does, but because it genuinely changes the texture of any relationship. A man who can stay rooted in himself while the storm is raging, who doesn't need the other person to manage his emotional weather for him, who can sit inside conflict without collapsing or shutting down, creates a kind of safety that very few people know how to build. And that safety is worth more than almost anything else you can offer. Now let me be fully honest with you about something. Everything we've talked about, anxious attachment, identity, boundaries, emotional regulation, real self-worth, none of it rewires itself overnight. No video fixes this for you. No single book cures it. Real transformation, the kind that touches the deepest patterns in how you relate to people, takes time. It takes discomfort. It takes tripping over the same stone more than once before you finally learn to step around it. And it demands something our culture doesn't value nearly enough: patience with yourself. The willingness to watch yourself repeat old mistakes without deciding that means you're a lost cause. The mistake isn't the failure. The mistake is the data. It's raw material. Here's a metaphor that's always stuck with me. A tree that grows in constant wind develops roots differently than one raised in perfect shelter. The roots of a wind-exposed tree grow deeper, wider, strong enough to hold the tree steady through hard conditions. A tree raised entirely sheltered sometimes doesn't have the root system to survive its first real storm. The work of knowing yourself, of facing your fears, of challenging old patterns, of building boundaries where none existed, that's exactly what builds roots. You can't see roots from the outside, but they decide whether you stay standing when the storm finally hits. And storms always come. Every relationship carries moments of conflict, distance, doubt. The question was never whether they'd arrive. It's whether, when they do, your roots run deep enough to hold you up without desperately clinging to someone else as your only anchor. And here's something that might sound contradictory after everything we've covered. Once you've done that work, once you've built those roots, once you've built a world that's actually yours, the relationship you eventually build, if it comes, will feel completely different from anything you've had before. Not because you learned to act differently, but because you'll actually be different. Because what you bring into that relationship won't be an empty space needing to be filled. It'll be a fullness that simply chooses to be shared. That difference is hard to put into words, but it's completely tangible in daily life. Two people choosing each other from a place of fullness, who don't need one another to survive, but want each other because they add to one another's lives, build something with a completely different texture. There's more lightness, more laughter, more capacity to talk through hard things without it turning into a crisis. There's more freedom, and strangely, there's also more depth. I want to close with what I think matters most out of everything we've discussed today. At some point in your life, someone handed you a story about who you're supposed to be in order to deserve love. Your parents passed it down without meaning to, through their own wounds. Your friends passed it down through their own insecurities. Movies fed it to you. Songs fed it to you. Advertising fed it to you. This entire cultural machine that builds expectations around what love looks like and who deserves to receive it. And that story, however well-intentioned, probably convinced you that love has to be earned, that you have to prove yourself, that you have to be good enough, useful enough, essential enough for someone to choose to stay. That story is a lie. Not because the world is fair, and not because love always finds its way to whoever deserves it most. The world doesn't work that way, and pretending otherwise is naive. But because the premise underneath it is wrong. Love isn't earned by making yourself indispensable to someone else. Love shows up when it shows up, to people who have enough clarity to recognize it, enough openness to let it in, and enough strength not to smother it the moment it arrives. And that clarity, that openness, that strength, nobody hands those to you. You build them yourself over time, through honesty, through the willingness to look at yourself directly without ducking into comfortable distractions. Through the courage to ask what's actually underneath the fear, who you are when no one's watching, what you actually want from your life beyond everyone else's expectations of it. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one question, not to answer right this second, but to let it sit with you, to let it work on you over the coming days. Here it is. Who would you be if you knew with absolute certainty that you're already enough, that you have nothing left to prove, that the love you deserve has nothing to do with how much you give or how available you make yourself, and everything to do with simply being fully yourself? Sit with that. Because the answer to that question is, in all likelihood, the most compelling version of you that you'll ever become. You made it to the end of this, and that already tells me something about you. It tells me there's a part of you willing to listen to something that isn't always comfortable to hear. That there's a part of you that wants to actually understand, not just react. That there's a part of you that already knows something needs to shift, even if it doesn't yet know exactly what that looks like. That's the beginning, not the end, of anything. It's the start of a conversation with yourself, and that conversation is worth more than any relationship you could ever have with another person. Because every relationship that comes into your life, easy or hard, will pass through the filter of who you are when you're alone with yourself. And that work, the work of building yourself, is the one job nobody else can do for you. It's the only work truly worth starting. If you made it all the way here, comment "I made it," and I'll personally reply to you myself. And if any part of this landed for you, subscribe to Eclipsophy to stay part of this. and hit like if it meant something today.